Layer masks make it very easy to limit the effects of both adjustment edits and content from image layers. In this lesson, we'll look at some ways to manipulate these masks. We're starting here with our layers file from the last lesson. If yours is not still on screen, you can find it in the Chapter 5 folder. We've got an adjustment layers folder that we created in the previous lesson, so let's toggle that disclosure triangle to open up and see its contents. Now I'm going to turn off the visibility of these first two adjustments, and I want to focus on the levels adjustment here. If I click to bring it up in our adjustments panel, there it is. You can see that I've dragged this mid-tone slider to the left here in the levels adjustment panel. To lighten the image, I'll toggle the visibility off and on. There's where we started, and here's where we've brightened the image. Now suppose you like that brightening, but you wanted to restrict that brightening from happening to a particular region or area in your image. Imagine a scenario where for this foreground area, we don't want this levels adjustment to be applied. We don't want that area to be brightened. Well, we can easily fix that. I've got my quick selection tool selected. You can choose that by hitting W on the keyboard. And I'm simply going to paint over this area in the foreground to make a selection. And right there we can see the selection has gotten too broad, so let's hold down the Alt key on a Windows machine. If you're on a Mac, you would hold down the Option key, and we'll simply make our selection much more precise. That looks pretty good. I'll reduce my brush size by pressing the left bracket key and just extend it just a bit over this edge right here. Now, with our levels adjustment layer mask active, and we know it's active because you see 4 frame corners here. If you don't see 4 frame corners, simply click on this layer mask. It's very important that the layer mask be active and not the background layer, for example. We've got a selection made now, and our mask is entirely white. Now, white is a color that reveals the effect of this levels adjustment, and given that the whole mask is white, that means the adjustment is applying throughout the entire image. What we want to do is take our selected area and fill that on the layer mask with black. And we can do that by going up to Edit Fill. The keyboard shortcut is Shift F5. And for Fill Contents, we're going to hit Use Black and press OK. Now, if I deselect by hitting Control D on Windows, that's Command D on a Mac, notice what's happened. If I toggle the visibility icon off and on, you can see that this area has kept the original tonality. It hasn't lightened up like the rest of the image has. Now if I zoom in here, you'll see a problem right away. And let's hold down the space bar to get the hand tool. You can see that we've left behind some telltale edges here that let people know that we have edited this work in Photoshop, and not particularly well for that matter. We don't want that, so I'm going to show you a better way to make this kind of selection on a layer mask. We're going to go to our history panel here. Mine is partially hidden, but I'm going to simply step back to the point just before we use the quick selection tool. Now what I'm going to do is click on the levels adjustment again, this time with the layer mask still active. Note the 4 frame corners, and I'm going to select the brush tool. The keyboard shortcut is the letter B. Obviously you can always go over to the tools panel and click on the brush tool icon. And what I'm going to do is select a bigger brush. I'm going to go up here in the options panel and just verify that our hardness is set to 0%. That's very important to have it set to 0. That gives us maximum feathering. And now what we're going to do is paint on that white layer mask. We're going to paint with black. So we need to set our foreground color to black. Now there's a great shortcut that will always set your foreground color to black, and that's the letter D. If you press D on your keyboard, that brings up your default colors, and black will always be the foreground color, white will be the background color. Now I'll point out that if you happen to have a layer mask selected, pressing D will have the opposite effect. White will be your foreground color with black as the background color. If that happens, no problem. Just press the X key, which swaps your foreground and background colors. Now with our nice wide feathering set, we're simply going to paint in here, and where we're painting with black over the mask, that adjustment is being concealed. Now if I zoom in, we have a nice smooth transition between the areas where the level adjustment is being applied and the areas where it is being held back. You can't see any edge marks here. And this is the way you want to work. You paint directly on a layer mask with a soft feathered brush and you have absolutely seamless transitions. Let's take a look at another method for manipulating a layer mask, and that's with the gradient tool. I'm going to leave the levels adjustment on here, and I'm going to click on this Curves 1 layer, and I'll toggle the visibility on so you can see just what's happened. We've made a curve that has a brightening effect. The curve has been pulled up above the original diagonal, so the image will be getting lighter. But if you notice here in the layer mask, the mask is black with this sort of glowing orb in the middle of it. That's from the gradient tool. Where the mask is black, this brightening effect has not been applied, but we see this sort of white circle that blends out nicely into gray. That occurs in the middle of the image. And let's toggle the visibility icon off and on. So if you look directly in the center of those mountains, you can see a lightning circular effect there. And we get that simply by choosing the gradient tool. The shortcut is G. And for this radial effect, we want to make sure that we have this second icon here, radial gradient, selected. And for our gradient mode, we want to be working from the foreground to the background. So in this little pop-up menu, click on the very first icon there, and that will guarantee that our gradient goes from foreground to background color. And now what we want to do to duplicate the effect of this curve is we want to switch our foreground and background colors, so we can simply press X to put white as the foreground color. And I'm simply going to click in the image and drag out. And you can see now, because I dragged further than I had in the original version, our circle here has gotten bigger, and if we toggle the visibility off and on, you can see that our brightening effect is now encompassing a wider area. Now that's with the radial gradient. If we choose the standard linear gradient here, and that's this first icon, then what we can do is make a nice linear gradient that reveals the curve at the top of the image but not the bottom. I'll drag the layers panel out of the way here. Now I've got white as my foreground color and black as my background. So if I move up to the top of the image and simply click and drag down, I'm drawing a line. Now to draw a straight line, I can simply hold down the Shift key, and once I release, look at what's happened to that Curves 1 layer mask. It's completely white at the top, and then slowly but surely it gets darker and darker until it becomes black at the point at which I release the mouse. The transition from off to on this effect is seamless, and here's the before version, and there's the after, without really touching this foreground area. Of course, once you've adjusted your layer mask, you're free to go back into your adjustment, in this case a curve, and modify it at will. Let's click on the On Image Adjustment tool here, and let's say that we want to not make this brighter, but let's go and find a shadow value down here. Somewhere right about there. We're going to click, and we are now going to make this darker. So I'm going to simply, with that point selected, press my down arrow key repeatedly, and you can see the effect is changing, but the mask remains the same. So now we have a darkening effect that's applied to the sky without touching the foreground. Now here's one last way I want to show you about how to manipulate masks, and that's with image content. So let's go to our Chapter 5 folder and open up the file titled Fort. Here what we'd like to do is take our top layer called Fort and replace the existing sky with the sky from our background layer titled Sky. To do that, we're going to begin with the Quick Selection tool. That's W on the keyboard. I'll increase my brush size just a bit with the right bracket key. We are going to select this sky area in here. And you can see right away we've got a pretty good selection. There's one little area here. I'll hold down the Alt key on Windows, that's the Option key on a Mac, and just paint out of this little ridge to get rid of that. Perfect. Now what we'd like to do, again, is to knock this out so that the bottom layer can show through. Now instead of pressing the delete key and permanently getting rid of these pixels, we're going to add a layer mask to do the job instead. Now if I go down here to the bottom of the Layers panel, we have our Add Layer Mask button. But I want to point out something very important. Right now we have selected the sky. If I simply click the Add Layer Mask button, Photoshop is going to assume that the sky is what I want to keep, and it's going to build a mask that will mask out the rest of the image. What I want to do is the opposite. The sky is what I do not want to keep. Now I could go and invert this selection by going up to Select Inverse, but an even faster method is to hold down the Alt key on Windows, Option key on a Mac as I click on the Add Layer Mask button. That will tell Photoshop to make a mask of my inverted selection. So I'm going to hold down the Option key on a Mac, Alt key on Windows, click the Add Layer Mask button, and you can see that the mask is all white over the area that was not selected, and it's black in that sky area, allowing the bottom layer to show through. Let's add a couple of little tweaks here to make this effect a little more believable. I'm going to select my sky layer here, and I'm going to call up the Free Transform tool with Control T on Windows. That would be Command T on a Mac. And those clouds look a little big for this image, so I'm going to grab up here in the top left corner, hold down the Shift key to constrain my scaling. I'm just going to scale this down, but I don't want to skew it. I want to maintain those proportions. Move over here in the middle. You can see that I have a little move icon where I can adjust this to taste, and I'll bring this down in size again just a little bit more, again holding down the Shift key while dragging down from this corner. Move this right about there. That looks better. I'm going to commit to this transform by hitting the Enter key. And now let's go and apply a blur to this layer so that we get a sense that the clouds are far off into the distance. In our filter menu, we'll go to Blur and choose Gaussian Blur. And a radius of 1.7 actually looks pretty good. We can see what happens if we go here very high. That's a bit too much. So let's go back down about where we were, right around 1.7, 1.6, and we'll hit OK. And there we go, a much better result.